Hello, mathematicians. Welcome back to another lesson in Math Workshop. During our last Math Workshop lesson, we focused on using our understanding of fraction equivalence in order to add tenths and hundredths. And so today we're going to continue with adding decimals, but today we are going to be using a method of converting decimals to fractions and then back to decimals. The teaching point today is mathematicians add decimals by converting them to fraction form. As always, I would like you to always refer to your vocabulary tool so that you have this piece of information in mind as you are thinking about the strategies going forward and using the academic vocabulary to strengthen your understanding. We're going to be watching a video that's going to help you better understand how to add decimal numbers by converting them to fraction form.
All right, this is fourth grade, module 6, lesson 13. And in this lesson, we're going to be adding decimal numbers, but we're not going to be using that standard algorithm yet. Instead, we're going to have our students taking those decimals, converting them into fractions, and then adding, and then rewriting that whole thing as their decimal equivalents. Now, why are we doing this? Well, the idea is we don't want students adding decimals simply because they're following mindlessly some rule. Line up the decimals and then add like normal. What we really want is for students to be adding decimals because they understand the numbers behind it. And so that's what this lesson is. It's merely a stepping stone towards what students eventually will be doing, which is adding using that standard algorithm. So let's get started. So what we've got here is we've got some fractions, and we're going to be converting them first to, well, they're already in tenths and hundredths, but first we're going to find like a common denominator. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that we can see, and we're going to take 6 and 5 tenths, and we're going to change that to be 6 and 50 hundredths plus 1 hundredth, and then we can add those together and you end up with 6 and 51 hundredths. And so what we want is then for students to say, okay, let's change that to decimals. So that would be 6.5 plus 0.01, and that equals 6.51. And that's what we're being asked to do. So let's take a look at this one right here. So question D. So this ends up being 6 and 50 hundredths plus 7 and 1 hundredth. And that equals 13 because we added the 6 and the 7. 13 and 51 hundredths. So how is that going to look in decimal form? Well, 6 and 5 tenths, that's 6.5 plus 7 and 1 hundredths becomes 7.01, and then we can add. So 6 and 7 is 13.51. Now, where did I get the 0.51? Really, I kind of cheated at this point. I looked over here, and I see that, oh, the answer is supposed to be 13 and 51 hundredths. Now, parents and teachers, that's perfectly okay. We don't need to tell students to line up the decimals and add. We really want students to gradually have it make sense to them on their own, and eventually they will have that standard algorithm under their belt. Again, they're asking us to solve and then rewrite the entire number sentence in decimal form. So let's zoom in on C because that seems to be one of the harder ones. So we know that we need to get our fractions into hundredths, so that ends up becoming 7 and 30 hundredths plus 6 and 87 hundredths. That ends up being 13 and 117 hundredths. Now, we know that we need to take that 117 hundredths, and we know that, oh, well, that could be 100 one hundredths plus an extra 17 one hundredths. So 13 plus 1 more, that gives us 14 and 17 100ths. Now that's our answer as a fraction. So writing that as a decimal, starting up here, 7 3/10, that becomes 7.3 plus 6 87 hundredths becomes 6 87 hundredths. Adding together, we get 14 17 hundredths. Got more of the same, but now the problems are getting slightly more difficult, and we have to remember that after we solve it as a fraction, we're going to rewrite it as a decimal. So let's take a look at C, and then possibly we'll also look at D, because those problems are very similar intentionally. So here, this time they've given us the decimal, and we need to first think about that as fractions. So 7 3/10 plus 1 8/10. So that ends up, since we already have common denominators, so we don't have to rename any of our fractions. So that gives us 8 11/10. But that 11/10 can be thought of as 10/10 plus 1/10. So really this equals 1 whole. So we end up with 9 wholes, because the 8 plus the 1 more whole. And we have 1/10 left over. So if we wanted to write that as a decimal, we would have 7.3 plus 1.8 equals 9.1, because 9.1 is the same thing as 9 1/10. Now if we wanted to, let's take a look at D. So D, we're going to start with 7 3/10 plus 1 86 hundredths. So that ends up being 7 30 hundredths plus 1 86 hundredths. And adding that together, we end up with 8 wholes and 116 hundredths. So we know that 116 hundredths, that's 100 over 100, 100 hundredths, plus an extra 16 hundredths. So there, we have 1 extra whole down here. So 8 plus 1, that ends up equaling 9 wholes. Plus we have an extra 16 hundredths left over. So that's our answer as a fraction. Now how would we write that as a decimal? We would write 7 3/10, 7.3, plus 1.86, that's 1 86 hundredths, and that equals 9 16 hundredths, because that matches that answer right there. That 9.16 is 9 16 hundredths. All right, so more of the same, only it gets a little bit more difficult. So let's take a zoom in and look at problem G. So G, we've got, let's see, we've got 8 6/10 plus, we've got 4 67 hundredths, and we know that 6/10, 8 6/10 can be rewritten as 8 60 hundredths plus 4 67 hundredths. And then we can add our whole numbers, so 8 and 4 equals 12, and then we can add our fractions, so 60 hundredths plus 67 hundredths equals 127 hundredths. And then I'm going to take that and I'm going to write it down here, so 12 and 127 hundredths, because we can use our decomposition to rethink 127 hundredths as 100 100ths plus 27 hundredths. All right, and that right here is equal to 1 whole. There's 1 whole, so 12 plus an extra 1 whole gives us 13 wholes, plus we have 27 hundredths left over. So that's our answer as a fraction, but really they want us to write it as a decimal. So it's going to be 8.6 plus 4.67 is equal to, and then we're going to write 13 27 hundredths. And we can see that 13.27 is the same thing as 13 and 27 hundredths. Now, parents and teachers, don't freak out. This is not the standard algorithm yet. At this point, we're still trying to develop in our students a deep understanding of the place value and of the fraction and decimal equivalents. Eventually, this is just a stepping stone towards what eventually the students will be doing, which is adding using that standard algorithm. And that wraps up 4th grade Module 6, Lesson 13, adding decimals by converting those decimals into fraction form.
All right, so as you know, you're going to log into your iReady account. Make certain that you are completing any assignments that you still have remaining on decimals. You're then going to log into your Zearn account and complete lesson number 13. Be sure to use your tools. Be sure to reach out to a peer to assess each other's work and discuss over the phone so you can have a deeper understanding. Sharing the knowledge and sharing the work together is a really good way of building your understanding and getting better at the skill, because sometimes you don't see things a certain way, and a friend or a partner can help you see it a little bit better. So sometimes that really helps. Be sure to also assess your work. Once you're done, make sure that you are taking the exit ticket. That'll be exit ticket number 13. Okay? Have a good one. Bye, guys.